So, our theme is mental health in Judaism, and this is a topic I've been speaking about off and on for quite a few years. Some of you know I also give classes for physicians on various medical matters. There's actually one coming up this Sunday. In case anyone's interested, you can ask me about it afterwards. But this is a topic that the physicians continually request, is the issue of mental health. No one needs me to tell them about the prevalence of various mental health issues in the world in general, and that very much includes the Jewish community. So what I'd like to do over the course of the 6 weeks we have is to talk about different aspects of mental health. Our topics, I believe, are stress, addiction, OCD, depression, rest and relaxation, and logotherapy. What I want to do, though, is more than just address each topic in miniature. I want to look for overarching philosophies in Judaism about mental health, the issues that are important as a Jew when we think about our lives, not just our physical care for ourselves, but also our minds and our emotions. There's much more to be said about it, but I actually think I'm going to launch right in instead to the topic of stress, because there really is so much to discuss. One last just opening note. As, again, most of you know, I like to have these classes be interactive with a lot of discussion and a lot of questions and so forth. We're dealing with a topic for which I would venture to say probably most people have incidences involving mental health on these topics within their families, among their friends, and so on. If we could keep the questions and comments to be more about the general topic as opposed to our personal experiences, I am always willing to continue the conversation by email. I stick around for a little bit after the class as well. But in terms of the comfort of everybody here and being able to address the topic, I think that we should really try to keep the conversation within the session about the topic in general as opposed to personal cases. So, our topic for the morning is stress. How do you define stress? You don't want to give a definition?
Being a mother.
Being a mother. That's fair. That's fair. Being a mother is one example of stress. Can you give me a definition?
The demands exceed the supply.
When the demands exceed the supply. Interesting. So you're already ahead of me by a step. In other words, you're talking about the person is in a situation in which the stress is already too much, right? I want to go back a step before that.
Anxiety.
The demand itself. Sorry.
Stress, anxiety, when you're nervous inside, when you feel you can't cope anymore. I think those are.
Right, those are inability to deal with stress, right? Those are situations in which one has a problem as a result of stress. But one of the things that I want us to make sure to do in the course of the next hour is to distinguish between stress and the way we react to it, and the way we handle it. Because I think within Judaism and within mental health, that's a really important distinction to make. The term stress is not actually a mental health term. Sorry, Elaine, you were going to say?
I was just going to offer something else.
Go for it.
I want something else.
Yeah.
You have to externalize it, so it's what's happening around you in your life that is making demands on your resources.
That is making demands on your resources. Excellent. I think that is a good approach. The word stress does not come from the mental health field at all. It's not a medical term. Right? Stress is actually, I think, a physics term. It's only in the 1930s, at least according to my reading, that it becomes a term for medical stress as opposed to just physics. You're testing steel to see how much it can bear, and you put a stress on it. If you take a look at the first source on your sheets, I brought you one example of a definition that I find useful. The stress arena refers to any event in which environmental demands, internal demands, or both, tax or exceed the adaptive resources of an individual, social system, or tissue system. Okay? Let's take that a little more slowly. Environmental demands or internal demands or both. Stress can be because of something out there that is straining my resources, or it could be something inside that's straining my resources, or, of course, it can be a combination, and very often it is a combination. Something happens that's external, and then my reaction to it increases the load, right? That's a case of stress that is taxing my system. Interesting question. Within Judaism, within Hebrew, we have some people here who are Hebrew speakers. What word do you use? Lachatz, good, that's a word for it. Lachatz is probably, I think, the one that would be used most in modern Hebrew for stress. What other words come to mind? There are others. Metach will be another one. Metach is probably best translated as tension, I think. And then there are words in Hebrew for other related emotional states. So, pachad, for fear. Right? Tiruf hadat, if a person is very upset, is a classic word going back to Talmudic times for it. But stress is, Ruth.
Are you using stress only in the negative?
Nope. I'm trying to keep it neutral. Got it. I'm trying to keep it neutral, although it's true that in the applications of it, I gave fear and inability to focus. Those are more negative, we tend to assume. But you're right. Stress can indeed be a positive and have positive results, and that's part of what we have to discuss. The medical negatives of stress are many, and I didn't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to go through it a little bit. What are the medical negatives of stress? What do we usually think of in terms of the way a person's body responds, or a person's general health responds to stress? That can be problematic. Cardiac issues, higher heart rate and blood pressure, right? Because your body has the fight or flight response to a stressful situation. That leads to an increase in heart rate. It leads to an increase in blood pressure. What else? Headaches.
Extreme pain.
Headaches and anxiety, definitely a possibility. All sorts of things happen neurologically to the brain. When a person is in a situation of stress, there can be a narrowing of mental focus because the brain is focusing on this particular issue. At that point, the brain can even stop processing other sensory information. You even notice other things because of the stress that's at hand. There can be a shutdown of neurons over time because of overstimulation, thanks to this fight or flight response. That's true as well. Ian, what were you saying?
Extreme pain.
Extreme pain can result as well. The body will metabolize fat and protein for people who are experiencing stress, and you'll have an elevated blood sugar, all part, again, of this fight or flight response. The body's trying to get ready. The immune system goes haywire. It goes in different directions at the same time, so that on the one hand you can have a suppressed immune response because the body is trying to divert resources to other aspects of what it has to do, and then on the other hand, a person can get inflammation, flu-like symptoms, allergic reactions due to the body trying to fight anticipated infections. So all of these different systems in the body, the heart, the brain, the nerves, the immune response, can all go haywire as a result of the reaction to stress, anticipating, I need to do something, right? Whether you're anticipating it consciously, subconsciously, unconsciously, the body is trying to deal with the problem as best it can. So, yes?
Would you accept the fact that from stress, the weakest functioning part of your body is the one that will be affected? Is this true?
What do you mean by the weakest part of your body? What does that mean?
What does it mean?
You mean like a person with a bad heart would be more vulnerable in terms of the heart? That's what you mean?
Yeah, that's a per functioning organ.
Right, so I was going to say something in the beginning, which I now will come back to and say, because I realized that I skipped it, and your question reminds me. I am not a doctor. No, this is really, really important that I say this so that I hear it from my own mouth. I need to be the one to hear myself say this. I am not a doctor. I am not a psychologist. I play one in classes on occasion. That's about it. But what it means is that on a question like that, I don't know. And I think it's a good question. worth thinking about. And it's logical. It's logical, but I don't know, and I think it's worth. I think it's worth the question, and maybe I can find out. But offhand, the answer is I don't know. Okay, so that's our basic introduction to number one, what stress is. It's taxing our systems and the body's response to the situation of stress in various ways, in various negative ways in particular. And maybe I'll look into the question of whether a weaker part of the body will be more vulnerable. I think it's an interesting question. It sounds to me like there's some variables involved, but I'd want to look into it. So what do you think? Judaism, pro or con, for or against stress? Stress, according to Susan, is just a fact. It is. What else? For or against stress?
Depends on what kind of stress.
So let me ask the question a little bit differently. It's fair. Given the opportunity to enter a stressful situation, would Judaism say go for it, or would Judaism say duck around it?
Go for it.
I hear a lot of go for it. That's really interesting. Anybody say no? Anybody say against? We have some, not personally what you are, but what do you think Judaism would say? I hear against it, but I hear mostly go for it. What's the logic behind those who say that Judaism believes go for it? Sorry?
If you believe God is with you, you can do anything.
Because if you believe God is with you, you can do anything, and therefore you have to put yourself through anything.
You have more strength. You have more strength.
What doesn't kill you makes you strong.
What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but what if it does kill you?
You don't have to worry about stress.
Then you don't have to worry about stress anymore, Ian says. Yes, Michelle.
It all
And then
depends. A lot of times you have to make shalom.
this is also true. I'm not even going into the social piece of this. I'm going into the personal right now. But the social aspect of it is you may have to deal with this, or you may have responsibility of diffusing it. This is true. Sharon.
Well, most people consider stress is necessary for growth. You know, you just can't go along like this. You have upheavals or you have some stress, and it helps you see what you have to see.
So we might argue that Judaism sees stress as a positive influence ultimately in your growth, and therefore a step you need to take. Maybe. We're going to see sources that are going to say absolutely not, but maybe. We'll see.
Judaism teaches us to face challenges and not walk away from them.
No, but that's why I put my hand up for. Sorry, but that's why I put my hand up for no, only because I think that would be what I call good stress. Like, of course, we all should be facing challenges or facing things that are good for you. Generally, you don't like walk into a fire, for example. I mean, you're going to face the things that are going to help you grow and be good for you, even if they're hard.
So you need to know what kind of stress we're dealing with. I'm going to take Dahlia's question, and I'll take the two here, Susan and Moja, and then we're going to go further because there's a lot to say. I apologize for needing to cut off and go, but I think we recognize the situation. Dahlia.
I just want to make a comment. My mother used to tell me about my grandmother, my grandfather died and left her with 7 children in Montreal when things were really hard. But on Shabbat, she would go to shul, and somehow that was her rest period.
So that's already a step beyond, which is coping mechanisms. Coping mechanism, walk out of the house and leave them there. Excellent. That's good. Susan.
Stress. When you say what's Judaism, when you have to deal with kids, you have to deal with stress. I think it's a matter of when you have to deal with it and when don't you. It's not do I walk away, it's what the situation calls for.
So it becomes a utilitarian decision. Do I need to, do I not need to? Okay, and Moja.
I was going to say that you seem to be asking the question as a black and white, stress or no stress.
Yeah.
And I think of it as a continuum, that it's no stress, stress, and distress. And where do I sit on the continuum such that it helps me further my relationship with Hashem or
They're not shushing you. They're not shushing you.
So it's hard for me to answer a yes or a no.
Right. I mean, there is a certain recognition that stress is always going to be a part of one's existence, and it's much more about how I'm going to deal with it. Is that where you're
No,
going?
I'm talking about it's on a continuum.
Yeah.
So it's varying degrees of stress.
Yeah.
So when do I say that's too much and it's led to distress?
Right.
And it's not healthy anymore.
Right. Okay, I hear that. Let's go a little further with it. I apologize. I see other hands, but as I said before, I will be glad to continue the conversation by email and after the class, but I'm going to go a little further at this point. The truth of the matter is, as I see it, that within Judaism you have to address the fact that there are sources that are for and there are sources that are against. We have both. That's the reality of it. On the other hand, and you see the sheet in front of you, which is just one double-sided page. I mean, this could easily have been 3 double-sided pages, but I had mercy on the printer. But I'm just bringing you tip of the iceberg here. It is clear within Judaism that there is a recognition that stress is harmful to health. That's clear going way, way back. If you take a look at source number 2, the book of Proverbs, a book in Tanakh, in our scripture, called in Hebrew Mishlei, a person's spirit will support him in illness, but who can bear a depressed spirit? That it's something that can't be borne. It's something that is unbearable. Stronger than that, a passage in the Jerusalem Talmud in source number 3, quoting a verse first from the book of Devarim, of Deuteronomy. God promises that when you fulfill your role in the covenant, God will remove all illness from you. The underline is mine. It doesn't appear in the Torah. The emphasis added. And God will remove all illness from you. Says the Talmud, these are thoughts. The illness that will be removed from you is a reference to your thoughts. On this, the classic commentator Karban Ha'ida, which I brought on the page there, explains, what does that mean? All illnesses depend on bad thoughts. Oh boy, that's a heavy burden to put on your psyche, isn't it? All illnesses. Now, he's not a doctor either. But I don't think, and I kind of hope, but I certainly don't think that this is to be taken as a blame the victim type of a comment. Clearly, there were bad thoughts. That's not where he's going. I think he's speaking of vulnerability. And the fact that a person's mental state will affect the way that the body is able to deal with all sorts of situations. Yes, Marlene.
There have been many studies done for people, and in some hospital systems as well, with people who pray or who are committed in any way religiously heal much faster.
Right.
They don't get better. I mean, it's an illness, but they heal faster and they live a better life while they're in the process.
Right. Marlene points out, I don't know if everybody can hear, the studies that have been done about people who pray and the way that actually can help them to deal with the symptoms of the illness that they're suffering from. I was preparing a logotherapy material. We're going to be doing that, I think, in the last week of the series. I saw a study from JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, came out in August, in their psychiatry journal, in which they talked about studies that have been done about people who have a sense of purpose. And people who have a sense of purpose in life, they find that as they get older, their bodies retain function a lot longer. They talk about grip, they talk about ability to walk, and say that a person with a sense of purpose, we're not even talking about religion here in the sense of Judaism or anything else, but your psychological state can affect the way that you function. No, that does not mean that if somebody has a spinal incident and they just think good thoughts that they're now going to be better. That's nonsense. But what we are saying is that there will be, the way that one reacts to stresses will affect health beyond the purely psychological. If you take a look at source number 4, passage from the Babylonian Talmud. Rabbi Hanina said, one may not sleep in a house alone. I don't know if I'm now condemning anybody here. I apologize if you see yourself in this passage, know that it wasn't targeted at you. One may not sleep in a house alone. What in the world is the concern with sleeping in a house alone? Rabbi Menachem Meiri, writing in the 14th century, maybe 13th, I think 14th, said, similarly, one may not do anything that would bring him to the test of fear, all according to his nature. The concern is that somebody who sleeps in a house alone, does not have others around, may fall into anxiety and fall into fear, as opposed to somebody who has other human beings around. Your mileage may vary. Other people may induce fear. But the underlying point that the Talmud is trying to make is that you want to avoid things that cause mental stress, that cause fear, that cause anxiety. One last source in this vein, the advice of Rabbi Moses Maimonides, familiar to us as the Rambam, but of course, as is known, he was also a physician. And he wrote, talking about bedside manner for a doctor. He's talking to doctors. He says, one should tell stories which gladden the patient, broadening his spirit, and things that will remove his mind, meaning from the illness, and cause him to laugh. Good advice. And again, there's so much more within this, but there's a recognition that tension, there's a recognition that the experience of stress factors can damage a person's health and should be avoided. And on the positive side, many sources within Judaism speak to the importance of joy, the importance of having a calm mind. When we do our week on rest and relaxation, I want to talk about that more. But if you take a look at source number 6, this is a classic, a verse from Tehillim, from Psalms. You got it. Serve God with joy. Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, bo lefanav birnana. Come before God with song. There's a passage in the Talmud that speaks of being close to God. God is manifest not in laziness or sadness or laughter or frivolity or empty words, but only through mitzvah joy. Joy involved with a mitzvah. And one last source in this vein is source number 8, Rabbi Elimelech of Lezhensk. You can't really talk about stress and joy without bringing a chassid in at some point. The chassidim have to have their day. So Rabbi Elimelech of Lezhensk, author of the Noam Elimelech, had a very interesting comment. There's a lot of emphasis in Judaism on humility, on being aware of God, and a sense of commandedness, that I'm not living in this world in order to do what I want, but rather there's a greater picture and a greater purpose in my existence, and certainly humility vis-a-vis other people. I shouldn't think of myself as greater than another, recognizing the value in other people, recognizing the knowledge they have that I don't have, and that's a great value. But here he comments on the dangers of humility. He says, the Torah was given in Sinai, meaning at Mount Sinai, so that one would learn to be very humble and lowly in his own eyes, as God did, in rejecting great mountains and choosing Mount Sinai, which is the lowest of them. We have a tradition that Mount Sinai is not some great big tall mountain, but it's actually low. And the message is to be humble. And this is the meaning of specifying why the Torah says that it's given in the Sinai desert. But one must always be careful not to become depressed due to great humility, as he might fall into depression, which is the great obstacle to service of God. Therefore, the Torah commanded that he be continually joyous. So there's a need, and that source itself could be an hour of discussion, but there's a need for joy, and we usually perceive stress as working against that, as taking us away from that state of joy. And as a matter of fact, the last area of the negatives in Judaism towards stress has to be a discussion of how Jewish law deals with stress. As a general rule, Jewish law tries to avoid that which creates stress for a person. Now, you look at me and say, are you kidding? Have you ever heard of this thing called Pesach? Who are you kidding when you say that Judaism tries to avoid stress? And I get it. And yes, fill in the blank for your own mitzvah that creates stress, that leads to difficult reactions. There are many examples of this that could be given within Jewish law. Nonetheless, the truth of the matter is that we have a very strong tradition of actually overriding elements of Jewish law in order to avoid harmful stress. So one example of this is source number 9. Dealing with a person who appears to be dying. The phrase used in the passage here, which is from the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, the phrase here is gripped by the world. But what it's a reference to is a person who is dying. If a person is, quote, gripped by the world, and he says to send a non-Jew for his relatives on Shabbat, is the discussion. Can someone please summon my relatives? And the idea is that the non-Jew who's going to go summon them is going to violate Shabbat in order to do so. The Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, says, go for it. This is certainly permitted. You're allowed to send somebody for this purpose in order to notify the relatives. Now, there is a prohibition in Judaism called Amira La'akum. It is a prohibition against telling a non-Jew to do things for me on Shabbat that I would not be allowed to do for myself. So, classic example, I want to be, right, most of the things that people think a Goy Shel Shabbat can do, they actually cannot do within Jewish law. If I walk into this room on Shabbat and there is no light, it's Friday night, the room is pitch black, and I want to read a book, I am not allowed to go to a non-Jew and say, please turn on the light for me on Shabbat. I'm not even allowed to say to him, you know, it's really dark in here, and let him draw the conclusion. No, I'm not allowed to do that. And in the event that he turns on the light and walks out of the room, I have to walk out of the room after him. I'm not allowed to benefit from it. There is the concept of what you've heard probably called the Shabbos Goy, the non-Jew who will do things for somebody on Shabbat, and there are circumstances in which one could have a non-Jew do something that the Jew is not allowed to do. But as a general rule, most of the things that people think you could do are actually not kosher, so to speak. So if I have a rabbinic prohibition, I'm not allowed to ask him to do stuff for me. How is it that I'm allowed to send him to get the relatives? Yes?
What if you didn't ask him to
go
and saw that it's dark and turned on the lights?
Right, so if he decides this on his own, it's still not really great. It's really best if he benefits from it himself. In other words, if he brings in a book and he reads, so he did it for himself, that's really the way it should be done. I don't want to get into the position of issuing rulings for people. I'm a big believer in the idea that you should ask a competent authority in Jewish law your questions in general, all the questions on all the topics, and preferably that's the community's rabbi who addresses these things. And so I'm going to avoid disqualifying everything people have ever heard was permitted. But the statement here is that if a patient says, I need to speak to my brother, my sister, my child, whatever it is, we are supposed to send a non-Jew to go get them. What's the justification?
Yes, they need to do this. It's not like I have tomorrow or I have 3 days from now. If you're dying, you need it immediately.
So it's true that it's an immediate need. Linda suggests pikuach nefesh. Pikuach nefesh means saving a life, looking after a life, literally. It's not here. They're not viewing it as saving a life. They don't view it as saving a life. This person is going to die, and sending for the relatives. They're not looking at that as extending the life. However, this person is in great stress, and as Rabbi Avram Gambino wrote in the 17th century, commenting on this in his work Magen Avram, the point is that we don't want this person to be upset. And in order to avoid stress for this person, we are willing to violate rabbinic law. That's the idea. There was a hand in this corner. I don't remember who had it. No? Okay. Yeah.
Diminish his pain. So it's the same thing.
Yeah, no, that's right. You're diminishing the person's pain. Not only that, there are even cases where we would override biblical law in order to avoid stress. Maimonides, in source number 10, deals with something which is called in Hebrew chover chaver. It's kind of an odd prohibition. Snake charming, essentially, is what we're talking about. Trying to charm animals. This is something which the Torah says you're not allowed to do. And there are two schools of thought in Jewish tradition as to why this is prohibited. One school of thought is this stuff can actually work and God doesn't want you to do it. The other school of thought is this stuff is silly. It doesn't do anything. However, it's often a gateway to idolatry and paganism. Because this is something which people come to believe in, and they start to believe in all sorts of powers other than God. And that's Maimonides' school. He believes that this sort of thing is prohibited. Seeking out conversations with the dead, that sort of thing. I don't mean when somebody just has a conversation in their head with someone who passed away. That's not the problem. He's talking about like the seance type of a situation. He says the problem is it leads a person towards idolatry, and therefore it is indeed biblically prohibited. But now take a look at source number 10. He says the following: one may chant over the bite of a person who has been bitten by a scorpion or snake, even on Shabbat, to settle his mind and strengthen his heart, even though this does not help at all. Maimonides, the doctor, in his Code of Law, Code of Jewish, his Mishnah Torah, says, I don't think this is going to do anything, the chanting that you're doing. And not only that, he actually has a separate prohibition for it. But he says, you can do that. Why? He is dangerously ill, this patient, from the snake bite. So they permitted this to keep his mind from being, quote, torn. What I call before tiruf hadad, shematitrov daito alav, to keep his mind from being torn, to avoid stress. He is willing to say you could actually violate even biblical law. Now the problem with this is that we have many circumstances in which Jewish law does not allow us to go to that extreme, to break biblical law for someone's anxiety, for someone's stress. So Rabbi Dr. Avram Sofer Abraham, who is a rabbi and physician in Israel. He was the head of internal medicine at Shari Tzedek Hospital's internal medicine B unit for many, many, many years. And he also answers questions in Jewish law by email, which is great. But his resolution of this problem of where do we permit and where do we prohibit is it depends on the degree of fear and anxiety involved. If it's great anxiety, great fear, and we're really afraid of a health risk, then you can do more. If there isn't, it's just a matter of relieving some stress on the person, then less so, yes.
So how far do we go, or what does Judaism say about supporting someone who is dying, and they turn to quackery? There are all kinds of cures, medications, which have no scientific evidence that work. But it's giving them hope
that
they can find a cure, something that's incurable.
Right.
Do we support that?
This is a very, very good question. There is a whole field in Jewish law dealing with alternative medicine, and the question of what do you do with medicines that have not been tested or have not been tested in a way that we accept. The Talmud speaks about the importance of testing cures. Back in the day when they were using things that we would not recognize as cures at all. The Talmud speaks about amulets as one example, and it wants you to use an amulet that has been tested 3 times on this type of illness and has worked 3 times consecutively. As a general rule, and I'm speaking very generally, the stance is that a person could use such things, and we wouldn't try to dissuade them from doing so, as long as it didn't lead them in one of 2 directions. Number 1, if it would take them against Jewish law, and number 2, if it would take them against standard traditional medical advice. Meaning, if they're going to adopt this, and as a result not do that which is tried and tested, then we have a problem. In terms of the first category, the Talmud has a discussion about a practice which has received a resurgence in the last 150 years, and that is that somebody who had been bitten by a rabid dog, the prescription back in the day was to eat from the liver of the dog, which in the last 150 years people have claimed since Louis Pasteur could be, an attempt to vaccinate, so to speak, by having the antibodies that have developed in the dog. I don't know. I don't know whether that's really any association whatsoever. People like to say it. But the point is that the sages who were pre-Pasteur, who dealt with this issue all along, said, no, you can't do that. Dog's not kosher. You're taking something that was perceived very early on as quackery and implementing it contra Jewish law, and that's where you run into a problem, or if you do it contra medical advice. Now, the big question, which I'm not answering, is the question of, so what constitutes tried and tested? There are an awful lot of people who will argue that which the government approves isn't necessarily safe, is being influenced by big pharma, and so on and so on. And so people get into other types of medicine, and I'm not qualified to answer the question of what should be approved and what should not. But what we have here, what I hope we've established, is, aside from our definition of stress that we talked about and the negatives that can occur medically in response to stress, is that Judaism is a strong voice saying that stress is harmful to health, that a response to stress which eliminates joy is not desirable within Judaism, and we have accommodations in Jewish law meant to reduce and to minimize the stress that somebody experiences. But now I have to turn the page on this, because there's another way to look at all of this, or this wouldn't be Judaism. If you had only one way to deal with it, if someone ever says to you, this is one-sided, it just doesn't work that way. We're hardwired differently. Rita, and then I'm going to go on. Yeah.
I just want to go back to number 5.
Yeah.
About laughter. I find
yes.
Very interesting about the nominees being a doctor recommending laughter.
Mm-hmm.
There was a gentleman named Norman Cousins who laughed himself back to health because laughter produces endorphins in the body. And when he was very sick, he had some disconnective tissue, and he was in the hospital, and he brought in comedies, movies, and he got better from laughter.
Right.
I just find that interesting, that the nominees...
Right. The idea of laughter being good for you is, I should note one thing, I feel bad saying this, because I don't like to puncture a balloon, but it's a really important balloon to puncture. So I apologize in advance. Most of the medicine of Maimonides, he acknowledged himself in writing, came from Galen and the Greeks. It's not as though he was there were areas where he disagreed with Galen, particularly when he felt Galen had gone over into philosophy of religion. And there are times when he says, I think Galen is wrong. But generally speaking, he's not inventing. This is something that human beings have, of all stripes and ethnicities, have been practicing for a very long time. I like as much as anybody else the idea that we've invented, the world. I love the emails that I get that talk about, all the inventions that we can take credit for. But at the same time, it's really important to be honest about it and to recognize some things are actually global. So our problem is that even though we've talked about Judaism not wanting you to engage in and to experience stress or its harmful reactions, Judaism seems to consciously create stress. I know of no nicer way to say that. Judaism seems to consciously create stress. I'll give you one example. They take a look at source number 11. Joshua takes over from Moshe, from Moses. Right? How do you take over from Moses? You can't even pretend that that's doable. Right? The human being who talked to God, right? Who could basically call in an airstrike whenever he wanted against whoever the opponent of the day was. When Hashem said, I want to destroy the Jews, Moshe said, no, you don't. Right? I mean, how do you take over from Moshe? The answer is you really can't. You just can't. But Yoshua, nonetheless, is going to give it the old college try. And Hashem, well, they're on strike. Fine. Some other metaphor. But in the beginning of the book of Yoshua, the book of Joshua, God gives him a pep talk in which he tells him repeatedly, Chazak ve'ematz, that you should be strong, you should be courageous, and hold on to the Torah that I have given you. And as part of that section there in chapter 1 of Joshua, it's a beautiful speech, very worth reading, Hashem says to him the following words in source number 11. This Torah shall never leave your mouth. Lo yomush seifra Torah hazeh mipicha. This Torah shall never leave your mouth, and you shall speak it day and night. In Hebrew, v'agita bo yomam v'layla. Day and night you shall speak Torah. Now, there is a classic rabbinic debate as to how to take this verse. Is it a blessing? God is saying, the Torah will never leave your mouth, you'll speak of it all the time. Is it a minimal command that a Jew is responsible to learn a little bit of Torah during the daytime and at night every day? Or is this a maximum command, saying you have a responsibility to learn Torah all day and all night? If you're not doing something else of merit, that's your default position. And I can tell you, as somebody who learned in the yeshiva system, that the third approach is the one you always hear as a kid. In the day school system, in the yeshiva system, that's what you're given to understand is I should be studying Torah if I am not doing anything else that is worthy. On the one hand, it can keep you out of trouble. On the other hand, this is a major source of stress. A major source of stress. I remember when I was in yeshiva in Israel after high school, generally there was a certain arc that a lot of us went through. You go in the beginning of the month of Elul, the month before Rosh Hashanah. And so you're there in yeshiva, and you have your regular day, which usually ends roughly 10 o'clock, and then you can stay and learn more after that. And then you build up for that month, and you get to Rosh Hashanah, and you get to Yom Kippur and Sukkot, and the yeshiva's closed, and you go to relatives or whoever else will host you for the holidays. And then afterwards you come back to yeshiva, and depending on what the calendar works out that year, it's basically mid-October when you get back. And generally speaking, by the first or second week in November, a lot of the guys are staying up until midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, learning, and then catch a few hours of sleep, and then you're back in the morning again at 7 o'clock for Shacharit to start the next day. And inevitably, somewhere around mid to late November, you go through burnout. You can't sustain that. It doesn't work. And then, hopefully, you find some kind of equilibrium, and that carries you through, the rest of your year or however long you're going to be studying. But it's a predictable arc, because this imperative of study day and night puts a real strain. And unfortunately, for those who aren't cut out for it, it's not their intellectual bent. It's not where their interest is. They can't find something in the curriculum that resonates, whatever the rationale is. They can have a hard time fitting in and start to feel there must be something wrong with me because everyone else is up until 2 o'clock and I'm not. Maybe there's something wrong with me. It can create big problems. There's a passage in the Talmud, it's a volume called Menachot, which I think illustrates this very well. There's a fellow by the name of Ben Dama who approaches his uncle, who is Rabbi Yishmael. And he says to his uncle, I've studied the entire Torah. Am I allowed to go learn Greek philosophy? Am I allowed to go learn Greek philosophy? And the answer that he gets is, sure. Find a time that is neither day nor night. That's the response. Now, there are all sorts of other elements in that passage that may be feeding into this. But the point, again, is you learn that as a kid. And that you internalize it in the way that kids do. Right? And it can create a sense of stress. That's one example. I could bring you many, but there is this sense of that. I'll give you another example from another area of Judaism, actually. I brought it on the sheet in source number 12.
Yeah, but Gita is really not to speak, it's to think.
The Gita is not really to speak, it is to think. Usually right, you're thinking of higayon in that sense, right? But at the same time, it actually is used very often to refer to reviewing a text, and often that is verbal. In other words, you're right that higayon is used today in terms of logic and philosophy, but it's not the only way to use it, and the way it's used classically is often speech oriented. You're right, though. You could have that. Take a look at source number 12. A student followed Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi in the market of Tzion. Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi saw that he was fearful. He saw the student acting in an anxious way. And he said, "You must be a sinner." There's a verse, Isaiah 33. The sinners feared in Sion. So it must be that you have sinned, and that's why you're anxious. And the student replied, but there's a verse in Mishlei, in Proverbs. Fortunate is one who is always afraid. Ashrei Adam mefached tamid. Right? Umaksheli bo yipol bara'ah, as the sentence concludes. Fortunate is one who is always afraid. One who hardens his heart will fall into evil. That's the sentence. So that's what he said, to which the response of the rabbi is, that is fear regarding Torah. There's a difference. That is, the good fear, he says, is fear that you will forget Torah or fail to fulfill Torah, and that's what I am pursuing. In other words, what's being encouraged here is a sense of anxiety. Maybe I'm not fulfilling my religious obligations. One more example. Source number 13. Flip the page, please. Passage from the Talmud. Rabbi Eliezer said, repent one day before your death. It's a good recipe, right? Good formula. Repent one day before your death. Rabbi Eliezer's students asked him a problem, right? Does one know the day he will die? So he replied, you're right. So he should repent today lest he die tomorrow, and then he'll repent his entire life. That's the formula. But again, that can create for a person a sense of stress. They're experiencing a stress, which is that of constantly reviewing their conduct and finding what they've done wrong and making it right. That can be really hard, unless they're just good at it and they stop sinning, in which case, great. But I wish you luck. There are many, many more examples that can be brought, but we're down to 15 minutes remaining, so I'm gonna move into answer phase now. We've set up the. I'm really gonna hold it for now, unless it's directly on that source.
Well, it's directly on what is the contradiction when medicine says to do one thing and it's exceedingly stressful. So which one do you do?
Right. What if your doctor tells you that you have to do something stressful? So I'll let the doctor resolve that one, but I'm going to deal with the Jewish one problem. I believe the answer is the word that I put there right before source number 14, and it's called eustress. Because stress can also have a positive health impact. It can summon helper hormones. It can help you to focus on a problem. Right? I mentioned before the loss of neuroplasticity, the loss of the ability to focus on other things because you're just focusing on this. But it can help you to solve the problem at hand. It can induce cell growth in the brain's learning centers. It can create a sense of resiliency. Right? There can be positive health results for stress as well. And many researchers believe that the key is what's called eustress. I gave you the source of all wisdom, Wikipedia, in source number 14, not because it's the only source I've looked at. I looked at quite a few, but because it's a nice summary, and at the end of the day, if they give you a good summary, you can quote it. Eustress, right? You understand what the word means. EU as a preface to something means what? What does EU as a preface mean? Good. Right? EU as a preface means like euphemism as an example. Something that is helpful, something that is good. Right? Unfortunately, it gets used in euthanasia, but there also the intent is the same meaning. The idea that it is a benefit. Eustress was originally explored in a stress model by Richard Lazarus. It is the positive cognitive response to stress that is healthy, or gives one a feeling of fulfillment or other positive feelings. Eustress is not defined by the stressor type, but rather how one perceives that stressor. It's not about the experience being different, it's about your response being different. Eustress refers to a positive response one has to a stressor which can depend on one's current feelings of control. Am I in control of the situation? Desirability, is this a good thing? Location and timing of the stressor. Potential indicators of eustress may include responding to a stressor with a sense of meaning, hope, or vigor. Eustress has also been positively correlated with life satisfaction and well-being. Eustress is uncomfortable, but leads to personal growth. It's not a different kind of stress. It's a different experience of it. And I brought you one study of many in source number 15. The study is titled, Does the Perception That Stress Affects Health Matter? Does it matter if I think the stress is good for me or bad for me? And the answer, of course, is when a study begins with that as a title, the answer is yes. The association with health and mortality. Look at this. 33.7% of nearly 186 million U.S. adults perceived that stress affected their health a lot or to some extent. Both higher levels of reported stress and the perception that stress affects health were independently associated with an increased likelihood of worse health and mental health outcomes. Right? If you believe that stress affects your health badly, more likely to have a bad outcome. So now we can stress about how we're responding to stress. Right? That's what we now need. This is meta. The amount of stress and the perception that stress affects health interacted such that those who reported a lot of stress and that stress impacted their health a lot had a 43% increased risk of premature death. What Judaism was looking for, I believe, is to experience stress as a positive. And the examples of stress that is embraced in Judaism that we gave, the study of Torah, concern for am I fulfilling the mitzvah properly, am I repenting from my wrongdoing, the goal is for a person to experience that in a way that promotes growth and mission, that motivates somebody to do that which is right. And this goes all the way back to the creation of human beings, way, way back in the beginning. Because the mission of the Jew has always had stress built into it. Right? Some of you have heard this before from me when we did our series last year on love and marriage and the like. We talked about this then too. Not stress, but it probably could have. But in the beginning of the Torah, when human beings are created, the language that is used for the creation of the plants, the creation of the birds, the fish, the animals, and the creation of the human beings has an awful lot in common. We are brought forth as life from the ground, right? Just like many of the other things in those first 6 days. God gives us a blessing of bear fruit and multiply, which He also gave to various creatures. We are created male and female, as many are in that 6-day period of creation. A lot of the language is the same for all of us. And the beasts, the birds, the fish, whatever, plants presumably, are roughly speaking stress-free. Not in the sense that they don't have stressors. They do, right? They starve. They have competition. They have the sources of stress. But we don't know a whole lot, and maybe it's just lack of communication, but we don't know a whole lot about them experiencing abstract feelings related to stress. They may feel some level of instinctive response to competition, instinctive response to starvation, or the like. But you don't have a sense that they are suffering in the way that we think of when we experience stress. However, the next step for us, the separation of human beings from these creatures, is stress-filled. Because the step where we are separated from those creatures is when God turns to human beings and He says, I have a job for you. Once God says, I am commanding you to do something, whether that is, don't eat from that beautiful fruit that's on the tree in the middle of the garden, right, which I put there, oops, whether it's don't eat from the fruit, or whether it is serve the garden, take care of it, or whether it is fill the earth and settle it, right, all of which we find as commands in the early going. Once there is a sense of God wants something of me, that creates a sense of stress, and we have to figure out a way to deal with that. And the goal is to deal with it in this positive way. Yes, Stephen?
So only twice in the Torah does it appear where God says it is not good. When Adam was created, when all the animals, everything was created, after every day, God said, and it was good. When Adam was created, it wasn't good because Adam would have been alone. And so loneliness, God realized, would cause stress. So He created two creatures out of the one, two beings.
There's more to be said. I'm going to leave that for now because there's more to be said about it. But yes, it is true that God says, Lo tov hayod adam levado, that it's not good for human beings to be one being. You need multiple. If you take a look at source number 16, I brought you one other example of this. which is in the very next story, when God says to Cain, when Cain is angry because God has rejected his offering, so God says to him, what are you angry about? If you do well, you'll be rewarded. If you don't do well, sin crouches by the door, but you can control it. You have to keep pressing. So how do we make our stress a positive? So at this point I'm not going to take questions and comments because we have 5 minutes to go. But this is just a selection of a few ideas. First of all, it's really important that we create conditions that aid our ability to impose a positive narrative on stress. To create for ourselves the mental environment that says we are in control. We are able to do something about this. So they speak about the importance of good diet, proper sleep. Right? That's certainly key. Maimonides wrote, I brought it for you in source number 17, having a healthy whole body is from the paths of God. You can't understand or know anything about God when you are ill, and therefore you have to keep your body safe. A very basic instruction is make sure you have the right conditions to be able to see stress in a positive way. That's number one. Number two, the idea of, I think someone mentioned it before, turning to God and saying, I don't have to handle this myself. I brought you a verse from Tehillim, from Psalms, in source number 18. It's fairly popular, right? Shlach al Hashem yahavcha. Throw your burden upon God, and He will support you. Right? The idea of saying, I'm not in this alone. I have the power, with God's help, to manage this. And yes, we may be aware of cases in which people who were good, righteous people yet collapsed. We may be aware of people who said Tehillim all the time, and yet were not able to manage it. But the point here, and this is true for the book of Tehillim, of Psalms in general, is that this is a work of faith. And it's a statement of, this is what I believe is going on in the world around me. And if you can show me a case that isn't consistent with it, this is still what I believe in. That's what King David is trying to accomplish here. And that's what he says to us, is to recognize that you're not in it alone. A third element that I find fascinating and really deserves its own discussion is source number 19. I'll just mention it now. And that is a study which shows that giving to others helps people to manage stress. Chesed. When you engage in helping others, that increases your ability to deal with your own stresses. Whether because you're doing something meaningful, or whether it's because it gives you a sense of control. I can do something about problems. It gives you a greater sense of worth. It distracts you from the problems you're dealing with. All sorts of reasons why this can be good for you. But that is a way to turn stress into eustress if you engage in trying to help others. And then finally, source number 20 is beautiful. There's a verse in Proverbs, in Mishlei, which says, Daga belev ish, when worry is in a person's heart, and then the last word can be read in two different ways. And the Talmud says it gives you both options. Either yishchena, he should remove it. If there's worry in your heart, get rid of it. Or, the other way to take it is, yasichena, you should speak of it with others. Find someone to talk to. Right? The idea that talking about it can help a person. At the end of the day, what we're trying to accomplish here is not to eliminate sources of stress, as much as to shape the way we respond to it. I don't think I'm telling you anything you don't know. I think people here are cognizant of it, and they're also aware of how difficult that is. But what I'm trying to suggest is that Judaism itself speaks to this, recognizes the harm that can result from stress and the way we respond to it, and tries to give us keys for how we deal with it. Creating a situation in which we're able to manage it, perceiving that we have the power to manage it with God's help, engaging in kindness to others, which is such a central theme in Judaism, and looking for social support, are ways in which we will have a better chance of dealing with it. Judaism says, you know what, there may be situations where we have to override Jewish law for it, rabbinic and even biblical, depending on the circumstances. But the first attempt is to try to handle it in a positive way. As I said at the beginning, I'm going to stick around for a few minutes afterwards to discuss. I also am very glad to continue the conversation by email. Thank you very much. For anyone who still wants to pay or register, come to me and we can take care of it. Thank you very much.